Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. Your support is crucial. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year or more. I do a weekly roundup of the news and commentary, which is popular. People are loving that. We also do every week or two a group private Zoom chat to shoot the breeze with paid subscribers only, to talk about current events, and sometimes I bring back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A. You can also donate through various platforms, DonorBox, Wise, Buy Me a Coffee. You can also purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about expatriating, Mexico, geopolitics, or the meaning of life. And our sponsor this month, again, is Mikhail Thorup, his Expat Money Summit, which is about to happen in a few weeks, October 7th to the 11th. You can register for free and watch it for free for the first 24 hours. Each day after that, you have to upgrade. If you use the promo Empire, you get $100 off. I'll be participating in the summit. Many of the headline speakers have been guests on my podcast, Ron Paul, Scott Horton, Doug Casey, Mark Faber, and others. And it's all about internationalization, which is something I highly recommend. I've done it myself. I've got 3 passports. I'm living abroad. And a good way to prepare for the coming New World Order and Great Resets. I also check out my affiliates, and joining us for the first time is Cameron Leckie, who served as an officer in the Australian Army for 24 years. He's an agricultural engineer. He's currently a PhD candidate. You'll find him on X, Twitter at Leckie_Cameron. The link is in the description. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Cameron.
Thanks very much for having me, all right, from Brisbane, Australia.
Yes, and I found you somewhere online. And I've been enjoying your commentary. You write for Pearls and Irritations, John Domenedu's Public Policy Journal, and I've caught some of your interviews. You were on Jerry Gray's channel. Jerry Gray is out in China. I've interviewed him on my former TNT radio program. I'll have to get him on the podcast here as well. And before getting your thoughts on what's transpiring around the world, if you could tell us a bit about your background and experience.
Yeah, so I just consider myself to be a normal person who's extremely worried about the direction my country, and by extension the collective West, I guess, is heading. And I sort of figure if I don't speak up, then who else will? So I think we all need to put our arguments forward for the best interests of our respective countries. But yeah, I guess I was all in with Empire when I was young and before I knew any better. I joined the Army when I was 17, straight out of high school. All I ever wanted to do. Thought we were the good guys, and we were there to serve our nation and spread, do all those good things, democracy and freedom and all that sort of stuff. And a bit of a slow learner perhaps, but it took me probably first half of my Army career and started to think, hang on, what's going on here? And by the end of it, I thought we're not the good guys. We're not necessarily always the bad guys, but we're certainly not the good guys. And yeah, we're heading in a direction which is sort of the opposite to what I thought my country stood for. And once you get to that point, it's time to sort of leave the military, I think. So left the military, and since then I've been writing quite a lot, and mostly for Pearls and Irritations, which is a godsend in Australia. It's one of the few outlets which actually provides a more open view of the world than what we get in our conventional legacy media and from our political class, and try and do my bit to mount an argument why we need to change course.
Yeah, and I like that you said that the fact that you're speaking up. I think as many people need to speak up as possible, especially professionals, people like yourself who've served in the armed forces or whatnot. We just need an orchestra, crescendo of more and more people speaking out. This morning I was listening to Dr. Ron Paul's speech at the recent Ron Paul Institute conference in DC. I was there last year. And he said a number of the same things that on the discussion I had with him on Geopolitics and Empire, where he said we just have to keep pamphleteering. Basically, what we're doing is like pamphleteering. Just keep speaking truth to power, and then hope something somewhere breaks through, that something gives. And that's one of the few things that we can do. And so I'm really worried about war, Cameron. I'm pretty much convinced at this point that the psychopaths that rule the world are taking us to war. You can see all the signals. I mean, Just this morning, some of the headlines, if I could read them real quick. You've got the defense minister, was it in Indonesia, warning of the rising possibility of World War III. You've got again, I think your recent contribution to the website talking about Australia's war against China. You've got was the Telegraph, I think, publishing an article saying basically that the British oligarchy is saying civilians must be ready to fight because Britain's military is too small. Someone sent me an article today from Canada. It says the odds of Canada being dragged into a major regional war in the next few years is 50-50. And they tell us, it says the next big war, it'll be a series. It will be a big regional war or a series of regional wars that Canada will be drawn into as a Western ally. Lukashenko the other day was saying, look, President of Belarus, we don't want war, but they're preparing to go to war with us. So I guess we sort of got to get ready now. So your thoughts on where we're at?
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with any of that. And my working assumption is that we will have some sort of major war, whether that's regional, global, i.e. World War III. That's my working assumption. And hence that, I guess, motivates me to speak out and write and things like that, because I think it's avoidable and unnecessary. And given, obviously, potential for a regional/global war to turn nuclear could very well be the end of everything. And what's the point? There's no winners from that. So, and I've got a young family and kids and all that. I'd like to see them die of old age rather than radiation or fireball from a nuclear weapon or something like that. So, that's what motivates me. But I think I really think we are heading in that direction, and I think it's the collective West driving that, and I really think it's just the inability of the West and the West, or the leadership of the West, to accept a world where they're not dominant, and as a result, that's what's driving all this. Like, you look what's happening in Ukraine, like, it's absolutely, by any sort of, you step back and forget rights and wrongs and that, but it seems clear to me Ukraine has no chance of winning, even with the West's support. But there's no inkling of even thinking of negotiating, because that would be defeat of the US and NATO, etc. So they keep going. And of course, we talk about Russia's red lines, or do they have them? We keep pushing them. It's like, why get to the point where we're actually risking a nuclear conflagration to work out where Russia's red lines are? It's like, when you're in that area, your margin for error is gone. So we have, somebody makes one miscalculation and that's it. But they just keep pushing until we hit that line, and it doesn't make any sense. I guess from a rational, normal person. But I think that's what the problem is, that our collective leadership is sort of they're in another world where the thoughts and concerns of a normal person don't seem to apply anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. This is the collective West. It's kind of obvious at this point, the Anglo-American establishment. Something that you brought up that made me think for the first time, it's always Russian red lines, right? You never hear that Russia is pressing on the West's red lines. So that's another tell. Like, it's like we've cut through 20 Russian red lines, but Russia hasn't really cut through, or the East hasn't cut through the Western red lines. You don't see the SCO or whatever, developing military security arrangements in Central America or with Mexico or Canada. It's always the opposite. So, that's another example. And if you could tell us, first, maybe because you're out in Australia, what's going on there with Australian foreign policy? I keep reading these articles, like from yourself and from Pearls and Irritations, that did I get the name right? Yeah, Pearls and Irritations. Yep. That it's the U.S. is basically making Australia like its 51st state. It's a battering ram for this coming war. John Pilger made the fantastic documentary, The Coming War on China. So your thoughts on where Australia is at?
Yeah, well, I guess if you go back through our history, so we had somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years where our First Nations people were here, and then 200 over 200 years ago now. Europeans settled, obviously under the British, and we were obviously closely aligned with the British right up until the end of World War II, when after the fall of Singapore, we lost a division of soldiers in Singapore. Many of who did not survive their internment in Japanese prisoner war camps. And Britain was, clearly unable to support Australia. So we jumped ship, so to speak, as to who our protector was. Argue whether we needed that protector, and that was the United States. And we had the ANZUS Treaty, so that includes New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, which isn't actually a collective self-defence agreement. It's, all it says is the parties will consult and decisions will be made in accordance with their constitutional processes. So there's no actual, if we get in trouble, there's no guarantee that the United States, for example, will come and support us. But, that's the bedrock, I guess, of our alliance with the United States, which in and of itself, I suppose, it's a bit of a, based on a bit of jelly there, because, the US will only come to support us if it's in the United States' interest. And that was, bubbling along. We sort of have a period of self-reliance in Australian defence policy, but then probably around 2010 or thereabouts, we sort of started to swing back to this dependent or more dependent relationship with the United States. Forced posture agreement, and then a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we had this AUKUS treaty, so Australia, UK, US treaty, or not treaty, agreement, was released on the Australian public with no sort of political discussion, debate. Citizens certainly didn't get a say, and I guess on the top of that is the submarines, but I think that's just a Trojan horse. It's like we're getting dangled the submarines as our defence capability, but really what it's all about is the United States getting increased basing rights in Australia, movement of US military equipment, logistics, all that into Australia, the ability for the US to use those as it sees fit, and for what other purpose other than a war with China. Of course, China is also Australia's largest trading partner and the source of our prosperity. So without China, this country would be nowhere near as wealthy as what it is. So we've got this irrational, in my view, fear of China at the same time as it's just providing Australia with its prosperity. And I'm sure the Chinese would be happy to buy our iron ore and other goods for the many, many decades to come without any fuss. And so that's sort of where we're at. AUKUS is starting to, there's mounting pressure against AUKUS from including, not just, normal people like me, but high-profile people, former prime ministers, former foreign ministers. And I think, the logic for it is being exposed and how risky it is. This is how bad it is, as we've signed agreements which the US and UK can pull out of providing Australia nuclear submarines, even though we've spent, billions of dollars investing in the shipyards and other sort of parts of the project. And if they decide to pull out because they can't meet their own capability needs, we don't even get a refund. So that's why it's been called the worst deal of the century, because, all the risk is borne by Australia. And for what? So we can defend our, there's a skit from a comedy show in Australia, which is watched, widely on YouTube, and you quite often see it put on Twitter and that. And it's basically, bureaucrats and military officers in Canberra talking about why it's costing so much for defence, and it comes down to we're putting all this money into defence to, defend our trade routes with China from China, which is, really how ridiculous it all is.
Yeah, and it's a problem that America created and started. And I do want to ask about Asian NATO, but before looking at, because I kind of lump AUKUS and the Quad into this basket of Asian NATO. Like that's what they're attempting to do. But let me ask you first about NATO. And I think the point, yourself and myself, we're both Westerners. And I feel like I have the de facto right to criticize. Isn't that what democracy and liberty is all about? I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm a Croatian citizen, a proud Croatian, an unfortunate EU citizen. I wish the EU would just disintegrate peacefully and go away. And NATO, if you study its history, you realize that it's one of the key nodes of this globalist imperial project. And in its own history, I've interviewed Daniela Ganser, the Swiss historian, on the podcast, who wrote the book on Operation Gladio. And the EU, you can go to the EU's own website, the EU Commission, where it says they admit that yes, NATO carried out state terrorism in the 1900s, in the 20th century, but whatever. And so they blew up school buses of children. They went into supermarkets and killed the Europeans, and so I view this at NATO as this imperial, aggressive, sinister force. Your thoughts on NATO?
Yeah, well, maybe at the end of the Second World War, there's that famous quote about what the purpose of NATO was to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the US in. So I guess that was there from the start. But I guess at that point, after World War II, obviously there's some immense ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the Western victors, allies from World War II. So maybe you could mount an argument it had a purpose then, but I think over time that purpose, at the very least, has changed, and it's all about maintenance of hegemony. Of course, we dress it up in human rights and all that sort of language and freedom and democracy. And I think you see that all the time as like the rhetoric about, authoritarian battle between democracies and authoritarian governments and stuff like that. Like they badge all these things with that sort of emotive language. But it's just a mask, I guess, on the underlying, reason for being for organisations such as NATO. And I think what they've been particularly effective at doing is that brainwashing of our publics to accept it for what the stated purpose or the public purpose is. Like and it takes a long time to go from, and this is what in my own experience, like I was all in. I thought the US were the good guys. They were there to help us. We're helping people around the world and support democracy and all that. And once when you grow up in that environment, and it's that's all to come to the understanding that hang on, it's almost the opposite of that. It's a very difficult process for most people. The cognitive dissonance that creates is very difficult. So I think a lot of people, it's all too hard. It's much easier just to believe. I guess it's like a bit like religion, isn't it? If you've been brought up in a religious environment, to try and change from that to something. I mean, some people do, but a lot of people don't. It's very, that's an extremely painful personal process to get from one belief system to another. And so it's much easier for people to believe, even when the empirical, I've done engineering, science, and that. I believe in empirical evidence. And I think if we look at the empirical evidence of what the collective West, led by the United States, has done, since the Second World War, it is clear who the aggressor is. But even though that is obvious, clear, without doubt, this is, I think, Professor Sachs said just the other day, the US is clearly the most violent country in the world since the 1950s. Even though that's clear and obvious, we can't see it because we're so sucked into the whole, what they have been effective in, and that's essentially the indoctrination of our publics.
There was this tweet I found that was from 2022, Paul Brislin, I don't know the exact source, where it said, quote, "As a German, I just want to get this straight. The entire Western world wants us to build up a huge army, march through Poland, and fight the Russians if necessary. Just writing it down so there are no misunderstandings in future." And it's just like what they want us to do now is what was done in World War II. I had on Andrei Martyanov not long ago, and he made a correct observation that it's like World War II is we never finished that war. We're just finding a continuation of World War II. And what you said about the cognitive dissonance of Westerners, the great British cartoonist Bob Moran, who I've also had on the podcast, he did a great interview on UK Column the other day, and he said the biggest problem that all of this comes down to is the refusal of most people to believe that people in power wish them harm, actively want to harm them. That is the hardest thing for most people to accept. There are a lot of people that just won't do that. That's too much for them. And I think that is, in fact, our absolute biggest problem that keeps us from going any further, because the masses just refuse to believe that there are forces that are actually this sinister and evil. And to ask you then about the Asian NATO, just every day now I'm reading firsts. There's the first time this happens, or the first time that, a Japanese destroyer sailed through the Taiwan Straits for the first time. We had recently the German warship for the first time in over 20 years sail through the Straits. And then you're hearing this rhetoric where the West wants South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. They're arming the Philippines. They're upgrading, for the first time, the military arrangements between Japan and U.S., between Japan and Philippines. Guam, they're laying down, missiles and all this stuff. And so it just really seems like they're preparing for something greater. Your thoughts on sort of the Asian space, what's going on there, and, Taiwan as well. And if things do pop off, what would that look like?
Yeah, it's and most people are oblivious. There's like spot reports, I guess, of So I guess Patrick Lawrence, one of my favourite American journalists, and he's got a phrase which stuck in my mind: the power of leaving out. And that's I think there's a lot of what we call propaganda in our Western media. Most of it is by omission, through its lack of, not including context, not linking ideas. So you see a report, which in and of itself is true, but it lacks the context for people to understand it. So, when we see things happening in like we've had a number of instances in the last couple of years with Australian Defence Force assets in the South China Sea or East China Sea, and it's been some, really minor incidents with the Australian Navy or Air Force and then the PLA. And of course, it's always the way it's reported. And of course, we only, these things happen on the high seas, so we only hear what either the Chinese say or our military says, and who do you trust, sort of thing. But the fact is, we're 6,000 kilometres from Australia's shores, and every naval asset is soaking up the electromagnetic spectrum, or they're putting sonar buoys out. They're not there just for the sailing adventure. They're actively collecting intelligence, which for what purpose, or some future potential conflict. But how that gets reported in Australia will be Chinese aggression, and so rather than a response to a provocation, which is really what all these activities are, like sailing through the Taiwan Strait. It's not about freedom of navigation, it's a provocation. And then if China responds, all the better, because then that way we can say we were just innocently sailing through the South China Sea and Chinese aircraft interdicted us, or did some aggressive maneuver, or they sprayed water cannons, with the Coast Guard in the Philippines, I think, recent. But what they don't obviously talk about is that the Philippines, I think China is very much a status quo power. So if the Philippines had maintained its outpost, on a sunken ship and that without trying to change the situation, China can live with that. But when there's attempts to change the status quo, that's when you see China response. But of course, that's great for our Western media and those driving it, because that's now an example of Chinese aggression. So we just leave out all of this context, which leads, I think, to the average person who they're probably extensive study on what's happening in the world is what they hear in the Channel 7 News or ABC News here in Australia. And if you listen to that, you would think China's the aggressor. And therefore, it makes sense that we need things like the Quad. We need things like AUKUS. It's great having the US here because they're here to defend us. And so most people are entirely oblivious to what's going on. I guess it's this creeping normalisation of these actions. But the risk is obviously that at some point we're going to get to potential conflict. And I think, Taiwan is possibly that. You hear this talk about war with China by 2027. In my view, that's our timeline, as in the United States and its allies' timeline for a war with China, rather than, China doing anything there. Ideally, they'll provoke a response by China, which can then be used for justification. And I think that timeline's important because I think it's hard from an outsider, but my gut feel is that given the state of the US empire, that's probably their cutoff date. Post 2027, or give or take a couple of years, they've probably come to the assessment that it's too late. China will be so powerful that they've lost their opportunity to regain hegemony. And I think that's what everything is focusing on. It's getting our countries and military capability to the point where they could do something by that time. And if they can't, then they've basically lost they've lost the strategic initiative. Well, I'll say they've already lost it, but it's beyond recovery. And if we can get to that point safely, I am actually a little bit hopeful, because we might actually get to the point where the US says, all right, we failed in that. We now need to work out how to live with China, as opposed to contain it, defeat it, cut it down to size.
I've had a number of guests say the same thing. Many people have said that the most dangerous time is from 2025, between 25 and 30, and that's that hot point. And it also would make sense because it'd be midway through the next U.S. presidency, which for the U.S. would be better than doing it, when the changing of the guard. And something you brought up, one thing that has forever bothered me as an American is American exceptionalism, and I count that as Western exceptionalism. I see, from Australians, I kind of view us as one family. It's the English-speaking world: U.S., Canada, Australia, UK, New Zealand, and the attitude. I've met, folks from all those countries, and I find with all of them this similar idea of exceptionalism. I'm generalizing here. There's good people in all these countries, but I have sensed this sort of superiority complex. I think a decade ago, Putin wrote an op-ed for the New York Times where he specifically spoke about this American exceptionalism, and it's double standards. It's total hypocrisy. And I'm coming from the Christian worldview, which the Bible says we are all on the level. We are all the same. No one is better than anyone else. And I think this is also part of the problem. Any thoughts on this exceptionalism of the West?
Well, that's the crux of it, really. I can bring it up, but Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister, he gets published at an organisation called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which we could probably talk about if you want at some point. But it's the leading sort of think tank for supposedly Australian strategic policy, but really about furthering the US alliance and bringing China down. That's really what it's turned out to being. But yeah, basically, you're saying that if I can, well, I won't mention the country first, but if this country sort of cut away its imperial ambitions and started acting as a normal country, then it could get on with life towards being a well-developed 21st century country. Of course, what he was talking about was Russia, but I think that's maybe just a little bit of projection, where if the United States could act as a normal country, an extremely powerful country, and if it actually stood up to all those ideals that you hear about, Beacon on the Hill and all that sort of stuff, then the whole world, including the United States, would be better off. But it's this, and this is what's permitted. I think this, not necessarily amongst the average people, but when you get into an organisation, the culture of an organisation, I can see now when I was in Australian Army, how that groupthink sort of mentality occurs. So how do you break that? Like when it's so deeply entrenched in that sort of cultural establishment of the, all the bureaucracies and the politicians and the media who are driving us in a certain direction. How do we break that? And I think that's if we could do that, we could turn things around pretty quickly. But it's so deeply entrenched, and it is essentially a religious type belief system. And I think this is the biggest risk, is because it is that sort of deeply entrenched ideological belief system, we're not talking about rationality. And this is where the logic of what they're doing makes sense, because from their perspective, they're trying to save a belief system more than anything else. And people go to extremes to do that. I guess one thing I'm thankful is my observations of China and Russia. I guess the global South, or the BRICS countries of that, they seem far more practical, pragmatic, less ideologically driven. So thankfully on that side, they're absorbing a lot of these what really can only be termed provocations. And I guess the further the empire falls down off that sort of trajectory from its peak to decline, that some people in that culture will start to wake up and think, oh, hang on, we need to change direction. We've got no choice because the way we're going is going to end up in a disaster. So that's where I think that there's the global South is actually doing its best to manage the decline of the United States without without resulting in World War III. But when one side is so committed to doing something, it's obviously extremely risky.
I want to get your further thoughts on BRICS, but what you mentioned, that it is like a religion. And in fact, I'll have a guest coming on soon, which I've been waiting to have on because I've never heard anyone breach this subject as he has. He's a German theologian, but he's talking about basically this democracy that we have in the West. He calls it this romantic democracy that, in fact, what it is. For me, it's a synonym for liberalism today. He calls it mystical democracy. It's a civil religion. Mm-hmm. It's actually a religion, and it's totalitarian in nature. And we're seeing that again in the West. And it just makes me think, again, I taught at the top university in Mexico, international relations, and many of my students I mentioned, I see their photos, them hanging out with Justin Trudeau, ultra liberal, globalist, warmonger, tyrant, and all that. And so one of my students, he was posting photos of his out in DC, and he's like, I'm visiting the White House, and he puts a photo of JFK, and I'm like, in my courses, I specifically taught about the deep state, about how the government took out the president, and it just goes over these students' heads, and like they got it at the time, but they're just so enamored by these positions that they get and these amazing corporations or with the government, the pay that they get, the accolades, and it kind of goes to what you're saying, that how do we shake people out of it? It's just what the system offers is tempting for many people, and then sometimes all of us will be hanging out with friends, or we'll meet new friends of friends, and we'll try to talk about some of these subjects, and you'll get people, I don't know what to call them anymore, like normies or who believe the official narrative and everything. And when you start to talk like you and I are talking now, you'll have this look on their face, like they look at you like you're from outer space. Your thoughts on this sort of liberal globalist, how a lot of people are enticed by this, and then how to snap people out of it.
Yeah, I think there's a toaster set off a fire alarm in the background. Can you hear that?
It's okay. It's not that loud. We can just continue.
Okay, all right. There it just goes off. So I guess, how do we snap people out of it? So there's been a lot of talk, and like the Red Scare campaign a couple of year ago, the Sydney Morning Herald had, obviously about China and war with China, and there's this constant talk of, coming conflict with China. Our opposition leaders said a couple of years ago, it's inconceivable that Australia wouldn't get involved in a war with China. And I mean, I tend to agree. But there is virtually no, and I've only seen one article on it, which was pretty lightweight, on the consequences of a war with China. Now, if you're an Australian, most of our liquid fuels would be affected. Our import, we're almost entirely dependent on liquid fuel imports, for our diesel, petrol, etc. Virtually all of that would be, well, not all of it, the vast majority of that would be impacted by war in the South China Sea or anywhere in that region. And Australia comes nowhere close to meeting its obligations to having reserves, 90 days meant to have in accordance with the International Energy Agency requirements. I think we've got a couple of weeks. So our entire nation would grind to a halt within probably 2 to 3 weeks of any conflict in the South China Sea. And then, that's liquid fuel, and that's a big one. But you go to so many shops in Australia, where it's a hardware shop, little cheap shots, or our, Big W and Target, where people buy clothes and that from, and you look at where products are made, virtually everything is made in China. Well, a large proportion of it's made in China. The same with a lot of our industrial imports of that. So Australia, if there was any interruption to those supply chains, like our country would essentially stop functioning over a pretty rapidly, short period of time. And we're not even talking about that. So I guess that's one of the things I'm thinking of writing, sort of doing a bit of work on in the next few weeks and months is what are those impacts? Because, why would you get involved in a war with a country where you actually, Orban said it, talking about the EU sanctions on Russia, it's like you're not shooting yourself in the foot, it's shooting yourself in the lungs. And that's essentially what Australia would be doing, is if we get in a war with China, we've shot ourselves in the lungs. And I see it, and I've written this in a couple of Pearls and Irritations articles, it's like we put ourselves in a lose-lose-lose situation. So the first lose is sort of the current one, and it's the best case. And I guess we're sort of, ups and downs, but that's just our general relationship with China. So, we've had issues in the past, and, it's always a two-way street. We're not entirely innocent, and sure the Chinese have, pushing things a little bit as well. That's like talking about trade tariffs, or they've stopped importing our barley or lobsters, wine, things like that. And, so these relatively minor, unless you're in the industries affected. But, we're still losing because we could be, just doing trade, but for whatever reasons, that ends. That's the first lose. Then the second and third losers that Australia's put ourselves in is with regards to if we get in a war with China. So Australia's prosperity, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is really largely comes from China and our trade with China, two-way. So if, for example, we get involved in a war with China and we win, so in with the US, and we defeat the evil communists. It's always a CCP, never the CPC. Like, we defeat the evil communists, even though we've got quite good relationships with Vietnam. So go figure. We defeat them, and what we've done is just destroyed our prosperity for the next, generations to come, maybe forever, because China is a source of it. And if the Chinese economy, political system collapse, breaks down, it'll take. For China, it'll obviously be tragic, but it's going to be tragic for Australia, because now where do we source our prosperity from? So that's a lose. And then the other one is, of course, if we do get involved in a war with China and we lose, well then Australia, a large island, relatively small population, will have annoyed immensely all of the Asian nations who are to our north and between us and China, will have immensely annoyed China, and China's obviously aligned with the BRICS and Russia and that in particular. We've just put ourselves in an extremely vulnerable situation where we're really just dependent on the goodwill of the Chinese government to maintain some sort of relation. But if I was a Chinese decision maker, well, if we've gone to war against my country, those terms are going to be pretty dire for Australia. So any way you look at it, we've put ourselves in a lose situation. And the, tragedy of it is it's all unnecessary.
I want to ask you as well, one of my biggest concerns, and it's been for decades, has been the loss of freedom and liberty in the US, in Europe, in the West, Australia. You were mentioning before we hit record the misinformation bill in Australia. You guys are living in the future. I mean, you guys already developed. I had an Australian guest on recently, Kate Mason, who talks about they're developing these 15-minute cities, these gulags where they're making it hard to own. They're going to make it hard to own a property, and then they're going to force you into these different parts of the country. And now they're legislating thought crime. This Orwellianism that's taking over the West, this loss of civil liberties we're seeing everywhere in the UK now, in Europe, US, Canada, freezing of bank accounts for thought criminals. I've had the US government deplatform me. And I still can't get over the fact that I can't believe we've gotten here in the West. We had this tradition of, it's never been perfect. We had always some semblance of an oligarchy, but it's really getting to the point where the boot is now in our face. At least before we didn't have the boot right in our face. It was behind the curtain, and now it's like, okay, they're taking the curtains down and they're making the police state overt. And sort of your thoughts then on this trend of the loss of our liberties, civil liberties in the West.
Yeah, well, I think that you're right. Australia's on the same path with this, and so literally there's a Communications Act, and they've introduced a bill which is called the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, MAD, and it is mad, which would basically give the government the ability to fine social media companies for content that was interpreted as misinformation and disinformation, and that could create harm or serious harm. And that would obviously be arbitrated by the government, or a government representative, a apparatchik in Canberra or something like that. So we're heading down that path. And I mean, this is part of the Orwellian side of it, is obviously, misinformation, disinformation is important. It's always an issue. I'd argue that the most impactful misinformation, disinformation actually comes from our mainstream media and the government. However, they're excluded from this bill. It's only focusing on social media companies. So if implemented, that would, I think that the fine is 5%. So if a social media company was found to have caused serious harm by publishing material, the fine would be 5% of their global revenue. So obviously that's going to be huge figures. And it couldn't be more clear, I think, what they're trying to achieve is that any dissenting voices are essentially too risky for the social media company, therefore some form of censorship will occur. And another part of the Orwellian aspect is they've given the public 1 week to put submissions into this bill. 1 week in a bill that essentially takes out our ability to express. This is what I think that they're threatened, is because traditionally we go back 50, 100 years, or from times past, who controlled information? It was printed media, then we had TV and radio, but it was largely one way, so that easy to control the narrative because it was all one way. But now with the democratization of information through social media, so anyone can have an opinion and get published, and if that resonates, it can spread and people can see other points of view. So they've lost control of that narrative. And what this bill is essentially aimed at is to bring back control of the narrative to the government. And it's quite interesting. You look at our politicians, Prime Minister, and like this topical at the moment is our Foreign Minister, Senator Wong. When they put anything on social media, I would say that 95% of the comments are extremely critical. I'd say with good reason. And I think this is just one of those ways. It's like, well, let's clamp down so that we can control the narrative. And that's a sign of the system that's in decay. And I say that because, thinking complex systems and, feedback loops, like negative feedback is a way of keeping us on the right track. So, you go off and say something silly, someone corrects you, and you go, oh, yeah, okay, and I change course and I come to a better understanding of reality. But what we're actually doing is chopping away that negative feedback so that the government can implement the policies it so desires, and increasingly that's that globalist sort of agenda. But without that negative feedback, these bad policies will be implemented and will actually be counterproductive because it'll increase the level of distrust. It'll increase the likelihood of programs and policies failing, because that negative feedback loop, which helps to keep things at steady ship, has been evolved. So it's seriously scary times. There's maybe also, I think, maybe in the back of my mind, it's maybe also a little bit of a gleam of hope there, is because when they get to this point, we're now at that sort of period of time, which might go for a few years, could go for decades, who knows? In hindsight, will obviously be clear. But it's that tipping point between the old system and the new system. And this is like a growing pain we need to go through to get from a system that has failed us to something new, different, which hopefully will work for us. But then I guess that's sort of why I write and do what I do as well, is because I want to get to that point. And so maybe, I guess that's a little bit of hope to think they're so desperate now, they need to do this, but it's actually a sign the system is crumbling. And, as it crumbles, its credibility gets lost. The opportunity for new approaches will come that will hopefully set us on a better track.
I like how you explained it that way, of how it used to be just one way and now it's two way, and I never heard it explained that way. And actually, I was thinking the other day, sometimes some of the guests that I get, I can't believe that I get them. Just as an example, I had on recently this guy Ned Ryan, who wrote a great book on the American Leviathan, the administrative totalitarian state. And, he worked in the Bush White House. He was in DC, and he was mentioning how he used to be on like mainstream media. He was like on Fox and MSNBC, and they don't invite him anymore. And now he's coming on podcasts like mine. And that kind of speaks to what you're saying, that the information is going where it needs to get out there, and listeners as well are then going to these places. Let me just go back then to BRICS. We started off talking about the coming Third World War. I hope not. But let's then look past that. BRICS, what the world would look like, after the war, or even if there's no war, after this transition, if it's peaceful, the whole BRICS world. How do you sort of see things developing there? I read this morning, Lavrov talked about they have this coming BRICS meeting in Kazan. There's people saying there will be attempts at sabotage for this BRICS meeting. They're talking about the BRICS. They want to coordinate the creation of this new BRICS payment system. I have a feeling that for the average person, life might be slightly better in the BRICS multipolar world. The economies will probably be better there than in the West. And so your thoughts just on BRICS and multipolarity?
Yeah. It's sort of interesting. If you were to read and listen to the legacy media and, politicians and that in Australia, you wouldn't even know BRICS existed. It's just not spoken about. As soon as you get in the alternative media, it's everywhere and discussed often. And then once again, when things get so bad they don't even mention it, that's a sign of weakness and a sign the system's failing. And I guess I'm quite hopeful about BRICS. I don't think it'll be a smooth path, and I think it'll take a lot of time. But you look at who's leading, in particular Russia, India, and China. These are civilizations that have been around for many thousands of years. So if it takes 20 or 30 years to sort this out, in their historical context, that's a blink of the eye. Whereas in our sort of Western world, it's like, anything that doesn't happen in the next, couple of weeks, let alone next few years, is seen as too slow. So, I guess it's going to take time, and I think they're perfectly comfortable. And when you're thinking about the sort of seismic changes that they're actually talking about, that's probably a good thing, because you rush into these things and you end up probably back where you started or worse. So I guess I'm quite hopeful about BRICS. Will the world be perfect? Of course not, but I think it'll be better than the current system. And this is one of the, I guess, key data points I think that can see why the West can't return, is that there's so more and more countries that are willing to, knowing the risks that they're taking with regards to potential for sanctions and other untoward actions by Western nations, they're still willing to sign up to BRICS or to be involved in conversations with it as regards to future membership. And this is an indicator that the strength of the West is now at such a low ebb that countries which otherwise, even say 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, 20 years for sure, would not in 100 years have thought about joining an organisation like BRICS. They're now willing to do that. And I guess that's a sign of both the weakness of the West, but also the narrative or the story that BRICS is telling, with regards to its mutual benefit. It's not about hegemony. It's not about dominance. What's not to like about that? It's a very appealing narrative for countries, and particularly, most of the world has been at some point the subject of colonisation or imperialism, and bullies generally don't understand the impact of their actions on their victims. And if we are brutally honest about how the Western world has worked over the last 500 years, that's essentially what it comes down to. So the rest of the world has long memories, and they can see an alternate system that's better, and they can see the Western system is weak and failing. Put all that together, and I think BRICS will have a bright future. We just need to be patient, because, it won't be smooth. There could be some backward steps. And we can see, like, it looks like a lot of attempts by the West to actually undermine that, like the recent issues in, I think, Bangladesh. Look like there's a colour revolution there, or maybe not a revolution, but the Prime Minister was replaced. You look at the actions they're taking against Georgia, and all their so-called Russian legislation, which is no different to the legislation with regards to registering for foreign influence you see in virtually every country. Like, so you can see there's all these actions, but I think the tidal wave is such that that in general, BRICS will move forward and it'll be better for all of us. And I just hope that at some point in our mindset, we'll just come to the realisation that BRICS is actually an opportunity, especially for a country like Australia. And we could grab hold of that and do quite well out of it, as opposed to fight it.
It's funny when you mentioned these civilizational states, or they have this longer memory. And just one of the stories today I got from El País says Spain's King Felipe excluded from Mexican president's inauguration over silence to request for apology for Spanish conquest. Spain has said it will not send any representative to the ceremony over what it has called an unacceptable snub. So Mexico wants Spain to apologize for its previous empire, and they won't do it. And so, I mean, that's just the latest example. I do want to get your thoughts on the economic dimension. I feel in the West in general that we're moving towards what some call neo-feudalism. Your thoughts as well on the dollar world reserve. There's also this talk of de-dollarization more and more, that the BRICS countries are moving away from the dollar. I think this could lead to some either a hyper sort of collapse in the West or a slow decline. But in general, I don't know how, if you could tell us how it is in Australia. I know the housing prices are absolutely insane for like an average middle class home. What I've heard in Australia, it's like $1 million or something. I just see this trend in the West of the target of the middle class. They're wiping out the middle class everywhere, and it's feudalism where you have only rich and poor. And any thoughts on the health of the Western economies?
Yeah. So in 2012, there's the Australian Defence Force. I don't know if they're still publishing, but it has a ADF journal, Australian Defence Force Journal. I actually got an article published in that in 2012, and it was titled "Dangerous Assumptions in Australia's Defence Posture" or something like that. But there's three things which I put in there with dangerous assumptions. One was the reliance on the United States, and I actually managed to get in there. In my naivety at the time, I didn't realise how. Well, I think probably it wouldn't get published now, put it that way. I actually spoke about the potential for a decline in US power, and that was one of those dangerous assumptions. And so that's, I guess, background. And then in, I think, 2018, so I was still in the Army then. It was my last year of actual service in the Army. I wrote another paper, and it was all about the future of the US dollar and what that would mean for the United States, its empire, and then, of course, what that means for Australian defence policy. That didn't get published. So, obviously, I think it was a little bit too close to the bone. And I guess it was 2018. So in the last 6 years, there's obviously things have changed quite rapidly since that time. I guess, I'm not an expert on finance and like that stuff. I think you had Warwick Powell, and one of my friends, I think he spoke a bit about this sort of stuff. He knows a lot more. But I think, what is the source of the US power? I think it is that the US dollar, and this is what my article was, it's the centre of gravity of the United States empire, because it gives its ability to, dominate, control, coerce, and also its economic strength, without which, it'd have to act like a normal country. So I do think that is critically important to the future of the United States. But I don't think it's in the interests of a lot of these BRICS global South countries for the US dollar to collapse entirely either. So I guess I think that, and according to my previous comments on BRICS, I think the US dollar will be around and quite dominant for some time to come. And I think we'll see just this gradual decline over time. and then the emergence of alternate trading regime. I mean, there already it seems every day news headlines you see some deal that's between two sort of countries outside the West doing some deal on something that's not going to be denominated in US currency. So I think we're just going to see a continual ebbing away at the power of the US dollar. And I guess the ideal situation is we have quite a gradual transition. So then, say 20 years' time, the US dollar is one currency of many different trading mechanisms. And there's all these alternate trading mechanisms which countries can use, to their benefit. So I think that's, I guess, a bit of an ideal situation. Whether it comes that way, and I guess it's hard when, especially the US debt burden, I mean, they can keep printing money, but it's going to come to the point where you end up with hyperinflation or an actual collapse in the dollar, collapse in living standards, and that could turn quite messy. And that's another risk, I think, because if it does end that way, that's when some madman in the White House or a madman under the White House under pressure from the men and women who are running the bureaucracy decide they need to go to war. That's the age-old trick, isn't it? It's when you've got domestic issues at home, you kick off a war somewhere else. So that is the risk. But I think this is a well-known risk amongst the BRICS type nations. So it's about a managed transition as opposed to actively undermining the dollar, because I guess the US is doing a pretty good job of undermining it itself. And I guess why I think there's no way back for the US. Are you familiar with Joseph Tainter's work, The Collapse of Complex Societies?
Yeah, I don't think I might have do I have the book? No, I've got the Great Wave. Yeah, I haven't read that book. I heard it's really good.
Yeah, it is good. And he talks about why do societies collapse, and it's because of declining marginal returns in complexity. And I think we can apply that to empire, declining marginal returns in empire. And I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce it, but I think 1848 was when the US took over, large parts of Mexico, California, and that became incorporated into the United States. Think of the return on investment, a tiny return, a bit of military force, and they've taken this enormous wealth. So let's say as a starting unit of a return on investment of 100 to 1, and then you look at every sort of imperial adventure since then, that return's got less. So, taking over Cuba and then the Philippines, and that would have very high return on investment in empire. You get to World War II, still the US ended up quite well, but the return is nowhere near as great as that initial investment. You look at Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the return on investment is probably zero or negative. Now, for those in the military-industrial complex who are profiting from it, obviously they get a great return on investment. But if you look at the system as a whole, the return is, let's say, at best net even, probably negative. And now you look at Ukraine, a negative return on investment. If we go to war with China, I'd suggest that'll be a negative return on investment. And there's no way they can, this is a physical thing. There's no way they can overcome that. And that's the direction things are heading. So the options are, some nihilistic cataclysmic war based on that religious sort of belief in their own superiority, or some sort of internal collapse through which a new United States, or maybe not the United States, but a new system will evolve. But there's so many different interactions and how this could take place and over what sort of time frame. You can theorise and come up with scenarios, but it's really impossible, I think, to know how it's going to work out. And that's why our risk management needs to be so careful, because once we get into a conflict, the different paths that could occur, none of them which are good, will end up being counterproductive. So we really need to do what we can to avoid getting into the position where we're going to be in that conflict. And you can see that BRICS is a model of doing that. As Warwick Powell talks about, positive peace. It's about building institutional. We talk about deterrence, but it's about building institutional capacity to have peace. Like if you're in a good trading relationship, you have your diplomatic exchanges worked out. There's no reason for countries to go to war when you have all of that built. It's like it seems such a negative way of trying to deter China. Like, what are we trying to do when we deter China? What's going to contain China? If someone says they're going to contain us, now we'd be mortified. Why not just build the infrastructural requirement, not in terms of physical infrastructure, but all the relationships, cultural exchanges, getting to know the other country better. We've got trade, we've got mechanisms to resolve issues. Build all of that, and we don't need to worry about deterrence. And I guess that's where, one of those things I think we need to argue for in Australia is, like, we build a positive peace rather than try to deter something, because deterrence, particularly for a country like Australia, is going to end up failing.
Yeah, I'd agree. I also want to ask quick about your thoughts on future warfare and technology. I think one thing that's not talked about enough is how, through these wars that we're seeing now, Ukraine, Middle East, other places, how the nature of warfare is changing, where your drones, particularly autonomous, these autonomous drones and technologies, and now Ghost X. I saw a video from Anduril, I think, which they're talking about shifting military thinking greatly. They're investing so much money, Pentagon, DARPA, all that. Eric Schmidt's of the world, the Peter Thiels of the world, Palantir, and they're creating these drones that can be autonomous. They're quiet. They can deliver any payload. I fear like a Skynet, Terminator, Black Mirror future. And there's multiple threads here. One is the warfare between nations. And then the other, I fear that a lot of these technologies in the future can be brought back home to each individual nation, which could be used for population control and police state domestically. So your thoughts, any thoughts on where we're going with these new technologies of drone warfare and other such things?
Yeah, I don't follow the military technology stuff particularly closely. But I think Will Shriver describes, we've got the democratization of firepower. That's what drones and all of these missile systems now. So you look what's happening in the Red Sea with the Houthis, and the might of the United States Navy has basically been kicked out of the Red Sea by a ragtag band. It's probably, that's the label I guess they get. I wouldn't actually agree with it, but this sort of relatively powerless compared to the United States, but just through that access to firepower, they've been able to basically selectively cut out who can use the Red Sea and who can't. And this is one of those great concerns. Same with like what we saw with Lebanon in the last week with the pager explosions. It's pretty scary stuff. And this is why we need those buffers, because the closer we get, the more tension there is, the more of these regional conflicts, like the closer we get to conflagration. And once things start, they take on a life of their own. And there's no positive outcome to it. So we know these technologies are there. They're probably going to continue to evolve. How do you stop drones being, there's one thing, nuclear weapons, it's relatively easy to control access to things like that, or, armored vehicles or something, but how do you control access to drones? It's impossible. The proliferation, it's already happened. It is pretty scary. And I think and this is what the red lines continue to get pushed by our side. This is what worries me the most too, is it's not Russia or China or Iran leading this. We seem to have no restraint on what we do, and including, I guess, that collectively, like what Israel's doing is just out of control, but there's no restraints. It's hard to see any positive outcomes arising from that, and they could very well, those sort of technologies could very well be used against civilian populations who are unhappy with their government, put it that way.
Yeah. Any further thought on the Middle East? Just some of the stories today that have come out. You've got Israeli Air Force Commander Tomer Bar saying, "We are now in Lebanon. going to prevent any possibility of weapons being transferred from Iran to Hezbollah. That's a mission that has become first priority. You've got Israeli settlers published map of South Lebanon with Hebrew names. And then Amichai Chikli, I just saw this just from a few days ago. He posts a map of Israel, Lebanon, and says Lebanon, even though it has a flag and even though it has political institutions, does not meet the definition of a country. And in the absence of a monopoly on the exercise of power, both internally and externally, the Lebanese government is not a sovereign entity. And just looking at that, just from an objective perspective, I'm like, that sort of talk is wild, in my opinion. You're saying like, our neighbor is not a country, so we can just kind of chop off, a part of their land. I mean, even from a Christian perspective, people who are pro-Israeli, I'm thinking like this wouldn't fly in any other speech of any other country. And so, do you have any thoughts on and then what's happened with Trump tweeted the other day saying, I don't believe it, but he says that Iran tried to assassinate him, and it's just really playing up into this framing of they've been wanting to go to war with Iran since forever. And so the thoughts on the Middle Eastern situation.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that Israel needs a war to get itself, needs to get the United States involved in a war to support, because it's got itself in a hole it can't dig itself out of. And I mean, I think that's what's largely driving, the increased intensity in fighting that in Lebanon. But the US is in a bind because I think it knows that this is that democratization of firepower. It's got so many military bases in the Middle East that if Iran gets involved, they're in all sorts of trouble. And we just have to look at Ukraine, the collapse of their air defense system, the ability to strike almost at will much of the military infrastructure. So there's these countervailing forces, and which way it will go is really unclear. Because I guess there must be some advice being provided to the US government saying, if we get involved in this, we're in serious trouble. Iran, I'm pretty sure, could shut down the Straits of Hormuz pretty quickly, which obviously would have enormous implications on global trade and oil prices, and could bring upon an economic, catastrophe. So. I don't know. I think it's in the balance. I do think Israel, Netanyahu in particular, has dug himself a hole from which there's no crawling out of. The only way for him is forward until it all implodes. And I think, once again, we talk about those civilizational states. I think Iran, they can. Patience is a virtue here. You have to absorb all these hits and shocks, Hamas and Hezbollah, they're fighting for their. It's interesting. When Australia goes to war, we send people over for 6 or 8 or 12 months overseas to some place which most of us would never have been to. We go about do our business and then come home and it's all over. But we're talking people who've been there for thousands of years. Peoples have been there for prolonged periods of time. So they're in it for the long haul. And you read the number of missile systems or missiles that Hezbollah has, hundreds of thousands of that reportedly, which I think, they talked about was 100 and something airstrikes Israel launched the other day. You'd think, given their history, that they'd be so far underground, so widely dispersed, that 100 and odd airstrikes is going to make no difference in the big picture. So I think Israel, if it pushes too far, it's going to backfire, because small country, all within range of people who are extremely unhappy with you, could destroy their, Israel, and the Israeli economy, from what I understand, is reeling from the ongoing conflict. I think there's a path of no return, but it's just a matter of for Israel, how does that all unfold, and does it drag the rest of the world in? Because it's one of those other, flashpoints which could result in that regional war. If Iran gets involved, and then Russia's potentially involved, now we've got the Russia-US, it just all unravels. And if you're not particularly scared of what could potentially happen in the very short term in the Middle East, you're really not paying attention. But, look at our media here in Australia, and there's no discussion on the implications of war with China, a war in the Middle East. It's just like, life just carries on until it doesn't.
We've covered a lot, I think, most of what I wanted to cover. Is there anything that, else that you think is important that I haven't brought up?
I'd just like to talk about the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for a little bit. So, it was created as a think tank to guide Australia's strategic policy, which in and of itself I have no problems with, but and it's funded by the government partly, but then it also receives funding from corporations in the military industrial complex and foreign governments, including the UK government, the US government, and also the I think that is from Taiwan. I think they've also received funding from the Taiwanese government. But they're 100% committed to US imperialism. They're not providing any actual options to Australia other than double down on our current commitments. So, if you step back about strategic policy, you'd be thinking, weighing up the risks, opportunities in quite a considered, coldly analytical way, but they're so ideologically committed. It's all the way with the US. We're never spending enough. We need to procure this. And there's almost never anything they publish which is outside of that sort of very narrow frame. And they've done a series of reports on the Uyghurs in China. And I'm not going to comment on what's happening there because I don't know. But what I do know is that those reports have been funded by the US government. They've been funded by the UK government, includes in the disclaimer, in the funding line in front of the report. And then these reports end up in the New York Times or something like that as evidence of China's actions against the Uyghurs. So, this is how the system works: is we have this independent organisation which is funded by the government, then funneled through into the media to build this narrative of evil Chinese doing evil Chinese things, which is helped build in Australia this sort of anti-Chinese and fear of the Chinese, which is pretty deep-seated. Like you go back to early days, the 1850s, and that in Australia's history, and and it has been there. The fear of the Chinese and Asians has been there since then. And then so this organisation is coming under increasing amount of criticism from the public because people are seeing what they do. But it's just quite amazing is despite all this criticism, you go to ABC News and who's their go-to people for, like the ABC's our state broadcaster, national broadcaster, who do they go for information? And they'll go to someone from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So it's just a neat little example of how they control the narrative in the country. But what does give me hope is social media, which is why we have to keep fighting against this misinformation, disinformation bill. Just because organisations like this just get they just cop it on social media because they're peddling such ridiculous lies and misinformation and disinformation. A great example was they did publish an article just the other day after the explosion of the pages in Lebanon. Obviously, I think we can all think that was Israel that did that. Then they published an article to say, given this as an example, we now need to protect our supply chains from China. And it's like, what? Israel's done this, and now we're worried about the Chinese supply chains. It just shows how ridiculous and how ideologically focused these people are, is that anything that occurs, they can turn into an anti-China or an anti-Russia rant. And it was the same we had on the local news. They're talking about Chinese electric vehicles, which are growing in prominence here in Australia. They could use that to control us or to shut down our transport network. It's like, well, it's the US and our Western allies who do these sort of things, not the Chinese, but it's the Chinese we're worried about. It just sort of highlights how propagandized we are and how we just need to break through this if we're going to have a future worth living.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, it's like the Chinese government isn't doing anything to me. It's my own government who's putting me on secondary screening when I fly into the U.S., who's banning me from PayPal and Patreon. That's my own NATO and the Department of Homeland Security. It's just like, you're talking about the Chinese. You guys are tyrants. You're like literally, I'm a U.S. citizen, and I can't even have. I'm having difficulty making a business to feed my family. Who's the dictator here? It's not Putin and Xi Jinping. I also don't paint them as some great guys. And yeah, I've lived in Kazakhstan, former Soviet Union, and I've been to Russia, and my private email is banned in Russia and Kazakhstan, and it's a complicated situation. And I think what you mentioned, the ASPI, that's like in the US, you've got the Brookings, right? The CFR, and they do that same sort of stuff. And, when I was living in Kazakhstan, I wrote my master's thesis in color revolutions. And I came across, one of my students came to me. I've told this story before, but she was a high school student, she spoke perfect English, and she was all about human rights. And she was absorbing that Western propaganda from these NGOs. And she comes to me, she's like, I wrote an essay for this NGO, and she shows it to me. It's in Cyrillic. I can read Cyrillic, and because I lived in Mongolia, and in the bottom it said National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm like, what NGO is this? And she gives me the website. I've got a bookmark somewhere. I go to the website. It's this NGO in Kazakhstan, and they're all over the place in Kazakhstan. And right at the bottom, it literally says financed by USAID, Open Society Soros, National Endowment for Democracy. And I was there from 2017 to 2020. And I told my superiors, and, Kazakhstan is an authoritarian light state. It's pretty tight. And I got a visit from the head of security in the city, in Semey. That's where I used to live, Semipalatinsk, Semey. And the guy took me out to lunch. I felt like it was a James Bond movie. He spoke perfect English. I'm a guy with 3 passports, so they're like wondering who the hell I am. But I told them, like, I genuinely, as an American, I don't want my country to overthrow your country. And then, we saw January 2022, there was this attempted color revolution in Kazakhstan, which failed. But just for me to come face to face directly with the activities of these institutions was pretty wild, and then, and so we've covered a lot, Cameron. I mean, thank you for your writing and for your being outspoken on X and over at Pearls, and Irritations. Are those the best places to find you?
Yeah, Twitter on there, and Pearls and Irritations. It's a great. It's not the only one. Like, there's Michael West Media is another good, but it's sort of where people can get a voice. And it's becoming increasingly influential, I think, because people. I won't say most, a growing number of people don't trust the system, and go looking for information. And Pearls and Irritations is one of those that seems to, capture those who are looking for a better explanation of what's occurring in the world than you'll get from listening to, our what I call legacy media.
Do you ever fear you might get in trouble somehow, deplatformed, or get a visit from Australian authorities or something like that?
Well, there's nothing I'm doing that's illegal. And, I think that what I write, I try to make sure is well researched and I can stand on its merits. And I mean, ultimately, what am I arguing for? I'm arguing for Australia that's a democracy, where our freedoms are respected, where people have a decent, they can live without fear. That's the country I thought I was brought up in. So that's what I'm arguing for. If that ends up me getting in some sort of trouble, well, it just indicates that how far down that path towards authoritarianism we've headed. So fingers crossed, I guess.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't doing anything illegal either, but there's a lot of people that aren't doing anything illegal in the West, and they're getting visited by authorities. Well, thank you, Cameron, for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you.